Center at Durban University of Technology. Monique was trained as a social worker and got her PhD in sociology from the University of Natal. And she writes predominantly on criminology and is going to be publishing in May 2018. And Monique has also more than 50 peer-reviewed articles, numerous reports, and she is a strong advocate for engaged scholarship and is my former professor, and I'm very happy to have her here. Monique, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you Andresa and everybody else at Oxford for inviting me. I feel like a bit of an imposter, I have to say, criminologist in an urban conference, but I'm going to keep this talk somewhat, hopefully somewhat informal, and raise some of the key issues that I think make what's called a good city. I have to say, when I was first asked to speak, I was really, it was kind of an open invitation to say, talk whatever you want to around the city. And my inclination, of course, was to talk about urban safety. And then I saw this thing about the good city. And I was like, oh my God, what is the good city? And then I had to think about that a little bit. So I'm going to share my thoughts on the good city. And with that comes some experimentation, which has taken place in the centre which I am based in. And so I entitled this talk, Touch My Blood. And the reason I called it Touch My Blood is that it comes from the title of a novel written by a South African journalist and obviously author called Fred Khumalo, who writes this book about his experience as a young person growing up in one of South Africa's townships. And the ability to be able to live through that experience of the hardship of township life through apartheid South Africa, which included just the day-to-day interactions and the harshness of segregation, separation, daily oppression. He was able to navigate that through the very physical action of touching other human beings. And then later also became a member of a gang and was able to navigate his way out of that also through this connection, through literally touching, as he puts it, touching my blood. And so from Fred Khumalo's book, I've kind of decided to stick to this notion of the importance of connecting, experimenting, and reducing harm in the urban environment. And I'm talking mostly about the urban south, but I hate that term. I really hate it. I'm using it because it's current, and I'm using it because it's been used even in this forum here. But I'm not 100% sure what it means, to be honest, except that I'm told that I live in the global south, and I'm connected to other people in the so-called global south, and I'm definitely not in the global north. So, hence that. But I do it with some degree of skepticism, and also because I think that some of the issues that I'm going to be raising are as much an issue in the global north as they are in the global south. But let me not be as presumptuous as to talk about the global north. So now let me try and move this thing somehow. Gosh, okay, right. Okay, so I thought what I would do, because as Michael was saying yesterday, this is as much a discussion about normative values, about how we would want to see the city, in as much as it is about anything else. And so I thought I would talk about key values or ideals in a normative way that we would want to see cities look like to make them into good city spaces. And so I wanted to throw around some ideas. Please note that a lot of these ideas are not mine. They are borrowed, and I haven't gone about referencing every single idea, but rather borrowing from them to make some kind of sensibility of the various things that I think make a good city. And then I'm going to talk about two different stories and how these connect to it. So for me, the main thing, which comes from John Feinstein and other people, is about this notion of human flourishing. That if cities don't allow people to flourish and to be able to reach their core potential, then that makes them less than good cities. That's the first thing. The second thing for me is this notion of consciousness. And that if a city is a good city, for me it is conscious not only in the way that it's designed, and I'll come back to that, but also in the way that people relate to one another on a day-to-day basis. That there has to be some idea of the conscious manner in which we relate to each other. And again, I'll come to that and where these ideas come from as this talk proceeds. For me, cities are good cities when they are experimental. And if cities refuse to experiment because they are risk averse, I think that that is a real deterrent from being able to develop a good city, because without experimenting, we really don't know what the possibilities are. And so I refer to this notion again of massive small, which is not my own, it's Kevin Colvin's, but it's this idea that from small experiments, we can develop massive ideas and catalytic motions. And again, I'm going to speak to that, some more empirical examples that I have. And what these experiments do, which I think is very, very important, is that it activates collaborators. It allows, doesn't mean that it happens, but it allows municipal governments to be an enabler rather than a blocker. And my experience is that often local governments block and enable, and that's really, really problematic. And that it also allows for the development of new institutional arrangements that may again start very small, but could be used as examples to be rolled out in other circumstances and situations. Already this was mentioned yesterday, but I'll mention it again today, is that I think it's really important not to believe that we can control all aspects of urban design and arrangements, that some of them are organic and should be organic, and that we shouldn't aim to control all aspects or formalize all aspects of governance arrangements. And then this is really maybe where I want to end these points. You can read the other two because they make a lot of sense without me having to talk about it. But cities should be cognizant of the burden of the future. In other words, we all live in particular circumstances, and we tend to focus a lot on the present. What is our current reality, and how can we deal with that? Or alternatively, particularly in the global south, what is the burden of the past? What has colonialism in particular done, which gives us a legacy which we need to deal with to move forward? And my point is that we need to say, what are the burdens of the future that we're likely to encounter, that if we don't plan for, we're not going to be able to be a good city? And I'll explain more about what those burdens are, but I'm sure you can think of some of them already. And I think most cities are not looking at the burdens of the future. They tend to focus on the past and the present, and that's a real problem. I'll give you some examples now, just so that it makes more sense, and then I'll speak to it as the talk proceeds. But, and let me talk about the global south. So the kinds of burdens of the future, I think, are intergenerational trauma, which may come from the past but continue to exist and will continue to exist into the future, massive despair and hopelessness around the lack of connections to economic and labor markets, which make unemployment a very real problem. And of course there's the range of ecological disasters, which are the burden of the future, which I really think that if we are not cognizant of, we may as well not have any other form of technological innovation at all. And there are various others, but I'm just giving you some examples of what they may be. And I think we seldom talk about these. Not the issues themselves, but how much they affect how city planning should take place in the present based on the future. And maybe that's where science fiction becomes useful. I put this slide in really because I couldn't let it go, because it was what I was going to talk about initially. And because really the two examples that I'm going to be speaking to are much, to some extent around safety. They're not just about safety. But I think that when there is insecurity, particularly in the global south, and again, I don't want to make this all about the global south because it happens in the global north too. is that we find that when there are moments of insecurity, the response to that is extremely state-centered. And that is despite the fact that, that states and governments are resource poor. There's just this idea that states can actually take control of everything, which of course they can't. And I think that the response to deviance or to to other forms of things which are seen as criminal or I don't know, conceived of in a negative way is generally quite punitive. That there isn't what Ingrid would refer to as restorative justice, which is a huge movement, and many of us have been part of that. But there isn't a restorative mentality, except in more indigenous spaces within the global south, and actually too, to be honest. And I think that the reason why there is always this knee-jerk response, almost, to be state-centered and to be quite punitive, is because it's a way that government is dealing with things in a risk-averse way. So that instead of saying, okay, let's just allow this kind of anomalous way of responding to take place, we'll take the risk by being punitive, by arresting people, possibly even by killing people, but definitely not by tolerating or allowing for an understanding of what the past was that has led to the burdens of the future. So law enforcement then becomes the first point of call. And I don't need to go into this in any great detail, thanks Andresa, but these are the consequences of what many people like Davis and others refer to as military urbanism, which is what I think we experience predominantly in the Global South, but not solely within the Global South. So what I'm going to do now, with that just as framing ideas, sorry, I keep on pressing the wrong button, is to talk about what I'm going to call two South African stories and how they then relate to the ideas that I'm talking about. And I've opted to speak about one story which is about the suburbs, the more middle class and upper class spaces of the city, and one which is the exact opposite, which is the non-affluent story, and hopefully to show how what I raised in the normative slide comes out of this. Okay, so the core story is a story about walls, and Park spoke about this a little bit yesterday when he spoke about the response of particularly middle class people being to fortify themselves behind closed spaces as a way of not having to confront and to deal with the realities on the outside of the walls. And so what we have in the suburban spaces in South Africa, in Mozambique, in various parts of Latin America, and let's not forget Los Angeles, just by the way, and other parts of the global north, but let me not speak about that, is that we find in the global south, and particularly in South Africa, and I'm going to stick to South Africa, but being mindful that this is not the only place that this is happening, is that we have these very high solid walls, and they're becoming more and more part of the urban landscape in South Africa, and really are based on what's called by some people an architecture of fear. And the reason walls, which I think is highly, is that they actually generate safety. The research that I've done has shown that this is not true at all, and I'm not going to get into that, but I think that there is this belief that goes with walls. So what do these walls do? These walls have very, very serious impacts. Firstly, they create false boundaries between people, and between other living beings, and between things. So if you construct a wall between the space in which you live, and I'm thinking particularly in, for example, singular housing individual units, right? What you're doing is you are creating a boundary in a fairly unconscious way, I think, between what happens within those walls and what happens outside of those walls. And that boundary literally stops any form of flows, whether they be human or natural or things. And there are a whole number of consequences to that. And the consequences are the following, as they've been listed. Firstly, it creates alienated and atomized citizens, people that don't feel in any way connected to one another. Secondly, it forms new forms of segregation. So who are you trying to keep out changes as well, because the problematic masses on the outside change. They're not always the same. So what would have been, say, for example, race, at one point in South Africa, to me now much more about class than it is in the current South African reality. I think actually what happens is the unintended consequence is that people feel actually more insecure than less insecure, because you don't know what's happening on the outside of that boundary wall, and I don't think that makes people feel particularly comfortable, or it may temporarily make people feel that they are. And what it does for the people on the other side of the wall, in other words, the people that are walking the streets or not having access to what's inside that wall, is that it really, really blocks what is physical and psychological access, the true access to the city that people talk about all the time. So what does this human-made solution, in inverted commas, do? It really shows a lack of mindfulness, a lack of consciousness, and a lack of care. And yet, this continues to flourish as a way of trying to build insecurity, while actually the consequences are quite the opposite. I'll get back to that. So I thought I would show a photo of what the suburban space looks like in South Africa, in many spaces. And you'll see these very solid, impermeable walls. You'll see that, for those people that are into CPTD, crime prevention through environmental design, there is no ability for natural surveillance to take place in those circumstances. There's no connection. There can't be a connection to the street or the neighborhood. It's not possible to have any connection if that's the boundary that you're going to choose to establish outside of on the perimeters of your living area. And what does it signal to the people on the other side of the wall? It signals, stay away, don't come in, we don't want you. And that is really a harsh signal to give to other human beings that are also part of the city, that are part of the same space that we exist in. But I think for me, even more shocking is if you look at that top picture, the technologies that are used and the mentalities used, to use sort of Foucauldian language, to secure the people that live inside the walls, is actually that they are designed with the intention to harm and to hurt intruders, right? So if you are going to interface with that electric barbed wire, you're not going to come off very well. You are going to be harmed. And people living in those spaces are intentionally wanting to harm other human beings that are trying to come in. Now that's quite a harsh reality, in my view, for us to be living in spaces that should be transforming. This is the opposite. This is also in a suburban space, but in a low-income suburban space. And for me, that's a radical suburban alternative, where the walls don't exist. And just as a matter of a story around this, because these photos come from research that I did with a police officer, where we actually looked at what the possibilities for violent crime were in the high walled spaces as opposed to places that didn't have high walls. And I won't speak about the results of that. You can ask me questions about it later. But interestingly, when we went into this particular house, and you can actually see that they've taken the walls down. The walls did exist at one point. And I asked the woman who'd lived there, and I said, how long have you lived here for? And she said, 17 years. And I said, have you ever experienced any crime? And she said, yes, I've had one cell phone stolen. That's it, in 17 years, right? And so what is this particular design, architecture, if you want to call it that? It really does allow for the connection between the home and the pavement. And there's something very sort of Latino-ish almost about that, although there isn't that kind of veranda space or that patio space that you may find in a more Latino environment, suburban environment. It also allows for natural surveillance, so that may be why only a cell phone has been stolen, be very difficult to enact a very serious organized crime in that household because it would be very visible. And so there's no man-made barrier, and I'm using man-made very consciously and woman-made, however you want to call it, between other human beings and other things, because things are important. If we looked at that last slide and we saw the barbed wire, that is a thing, but that thing is highly animated. It's not just a thing, it acts. It acts and it has impact. And so I think that's really important for us to remember as well. And so essentially what's important about this design, about this breaking down of the walls, is that it allows for flows, both human, natural in terms of environmental, and thing-like. I couldn't think of another word, so thing-like is not, I haven't borrowed it from anyone, except from our own crazy imagination. Okay, story number 2, and I'm going to come back to both of these stories in a second, is on the other side of the suburban middle class. Because even that one home is in a fairly lower middle class area. Okay. But I spend a lot of time now working with people who use drugs, and particularly people who use heroin, most of whom live on the streets. And this is becoming an increasing issue in the suburban, I mean in the global south. But of course is also a problem in the global north. I mean, interestingly, heroin is on the increase in places like France and the USA, in as much as it is in the global south. So as much as anybody else, people who use drugs, and for those of you who work with so-called key population groupings, that's just an acronym, PWUD, people use drugs, they are part of the urban landscape, they are impacted by the urban landscape, but they also impact upon it. So that they create their own spaces and their own ways of coping with the urban landscape. And of course they choose how and where to live based on what is accessible or not accessible to them in the urban landscape. They are an incredibly vulnerable grouping and often don't engage in health-seeking and welfare-seeking behavior, which makes their daily existence much harsher. And of course, through the immediate return to punitive military-like responses, we have people that are shunted between spaces all the time. So people who use drugs who may congregate in communities tend to be taken out of one space, placed in another. They're just seen almost, I think, as non-human entities living in urban spaces. And where does this come from? It comes from what I see as an incredible moral conservatism, which governs the way in which we understand certain population groupings. So that people who use drugs are seen as lacking in some form of morality, rather than being people who have either chosen to live in a particular way or whose realities have led them to try and blunt the daily harsh existence that they live in. And so people who use drugs, who live on the streets, who are not the kinds of people that take cocaine once a month and are corporate executives, are generally people that are struggling with intergenerational trauma and with the trauma of the present, and that they, in my understanding, experience zero human flourishing, none at all. There's no possibility of human flourishing for them, and there is no psychological access to the city. That doesn't exist. They do not feel that the city is their space at all, especially when they're being shunted backwards and forwards. And so for me, there has to be an alternative to this way of dealing with people who use drugs in the city, and for it to be a good city. And just as in the example of having high fortress spaces, as an alternative is the breaking down of walls, the alternative approach in relation to people who use drugs is not the war on drugs, but rather the harm reduction approach. How do we reduce the harms associated with drug use in urban spaces? And I will return to this notion of harm reduction in a minute if people want me to. So this is what our streets and cities, that's it. Thank you very much.
It's wonderful, Monique. Thank you very much for your talk and for giving us so much to discuss. I'm sure there are many questions, but as I have the microphone, I will start. And I actually have two questions. One thing that called a lot of my attention was this idea of the burden of the future. And I agree with you, and coming from the so-called global south myself, yes, we have to deal with the burdens of the past and aspects of colonialism and long history of slavery and so on, and the burden of the present. And of course, it's very difficult to engage with the burden of the future. And that's actually the how is my question, you know? Like when the present is so pressing and oppressing, and so intense, and it's very hard to plan for the future when you deal with issues of, you know, informal jobs and housing, and really your day is one by one. So this is a question. And the second question is, when thinking about this provocation you had about global south, global north, and how aspects that we discuss in the global south also happens in the global north, you were talking about walls and made me think about Brexit and, you know, migration and other types of walls where you're here and people are not like really building walls around their house in Oxford, for example, but to migrate, to move between countries, to move between space becomes more difficult with different types of walls, while in places like South Africa or Brazil, the walls we build are against our own people. And that reminds me of that book, A Country at War with Itself by Art Becker, when he discussed exactly that, where you don't have this idea of external enemies anymore, but crime is so ubiquitous and so everywhere that you get walled against in the city, against the people from that city. And in Rio, for example, now you have military intervention. So you have the military, the war army against its own people. And if you could talk a little bit about that, that would be great. And I just want to see the hands for more questions. So I have Nick, so do you want to?
One by one, because I'll forget. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Andresa. I'll answer the second one first. I mean, the issue about walls is that walls are both psychological and physical. You know, they're not just physical walls. They are psychological walls which we build within our minds, which put us in a different space from other people at a psychological level. And those psychological walls are either the result of physical walls or they lead to the creation of physical walls. And so, and they happen amongst all people in cities, but predominantly I think they happen amongst those that have resources. And so yes, we do have, as Antony Becker talks about, we do have a country at war with itself. And I suppose what I'm saying is that these walls, be they physical or metaphysical, are not the solution to anything. I mean, of course, those people who come from the US, I mean, the wall thing is not just metaphorical, real. You know, the wall that Donald Trump is talking about is not a small thing. You know, it's a literal thing of saying keep out of our space, stay away. You know, to Mexican people. Interestingly, just as it was quite a joke to me, but the New York Times during the election period were horrified by Trump and his walls idea, as you can imagine, being a more left-oriented newspaper, and they picked up on the Durban City Without Walls project, which is kind of really bizarre. But I think it was because they were trying to show that this is something that affects people all over the world, and walls are not a solution. They are simply not a solution. But anyway, they are not new. They are not a form of post-modernity or modernity. They've existed since antiquity. And of course they haven't, you know, they've always been about exclusion. And then to get to the issue of the burden of the present, my answer to you about that is we have to consider the burden of the present. But the burden of the present is going to become the burden of the future. And if we don't take cognizance of it, the burden of the future is going to become much more serious than the burden of the present. So I should have put the present and the future, but the reason I didn't put the present is because the present is what we think we're dealing with, without taking cognizance of what is going to happen. to the current problems that we have and how much more extreme they're going to get, you know. It's very easy for ecological scientists to recognize that. It's much less easy for human scientists to recognize the burdens of the future.
Hi, Nick Manning from King's College London. Thank you very much for a fantastically interesting talk. I just wanted to, as it were, push back slightly on perhaps a contradiction in your own position to see what you do with it. You talk about, in a sense, inviting conservative society to accept that harm reduction, to accept that people use drugs in society. What if you turned that argument around about the walls and said, well, you have to accept that people like having walls? I actually live most of my time in Switzerland, where lots of people surround their houses with walls in a completely different, much safer environment. And the question is, how do you then have policies which, rather than idealistically say they should all go, and you're probably doomed to failure on that, is to how we work round and with that issue, a bit like harm reduction.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, sorry. That's a question that comes up all the time. You know, it comes up particularly from people who live in gated estates. You know, in other words, so your question is, what does that do for people who have the right to choose the kind of space that they want to live in? You know, it's a complicated, it's a complicated thing that, you know, because in the case that you're talking about in Switzerland, walls are often there not out of because people feel safer, but because of privacy. Yeah, and I think that often we have to balance out what is the cost of privacy, not in places like Switzerland necessarily, but in places where actually your privacy may cost you your life, to be quite honest, you know. So I think, you know, different spaces require different interventions, and yes, you're right. I mean, I don't know if having a wall is a form of harm reduction, but it's certainly about a liberal choice to be able to do what you want in your urban space, right? And that will always have to be something that is weighed up and measured against. But perhaps it's about thinking creatively about, okay, what should the walls look like, and how solid should they be, and how impermeable should they be, and should they be places which make them more visible, and should your behavior as a person living behind that wall be more mindful? So if somebody comes to your gate and says, I have nothing, it's your obligation to actually respond to that rather than to ignore, you know. So that would be my response to the question that you asked.
I'm Alex Georgiadou, University of Manchester. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. And over the past few years, indeed, it has been major conversation on how constructing a good city is associated with the signifiers of experimentation, laboratory, boldness, ambition, strategic, all the signifiers that you use, as if they in themselves are transformative in constructing a good city. Is it not the case that the same signifiers of experimentation, normative, strategic, polycentric are mobilized much more effectively precisely by those who want to maintain the barriers, the infliction of harm, etc., that our worst enemies, so to speak. Those have a very different idea of what a good city is, that is the walled city, the exclusive city, etc., but also bold, strategic, innovative, experimental. Take, for example, someone who we all know, Trump. He is experimental, he is bold, he is innovative, and he tries to reduce harm to some people while inflicting harm on others. So the question I ultimately have, can we really do something with those signifiers that we tend to mobilize as the vehicle to go to a good city, given that the same signifiers are used by the worst enemies of that sort of model?
I mean, absolutely. You know, I mean, people will experiment with things that are, you know, that are normatively good and bad. Let's put it that way. But I think, you know, what I didn't speak about in the first slide because I thought it was fairly obvious, but maybe it's not. Maybe I should have raised it much more evidently are the last two as normative values, which is this notion of affordability as part of the experimenting, rather than being competitive. And the second one is tangible equality. Now, if those are part of your normative sort of values, then it does mean that some experiments are not good and others are, right? Yeah. So not all experimentation is good, but if we don't allow for experimentation at all, which is what happens currently I would say, not just in South Africa, but in other countries too, is that there is this bureaucratic inertia, that, you know, bureaucratic ways of doing things will ultimately allow us to get to where we want to be. And so while experimentation may happen in parts of America because someone like Donald Trump may want it in his normative goal, it's not what is generally seen as being possible. And the responsibility for people like ourselves, who do have as a normative outcome tangible equality, will be to say some experiments are not what we support and others are, but we can't stop those other experiments from happening, whether they be nuclear or they be any other form of experimentation.
Thanks, Monique, for that wonderful keynote. I wondered if you could reflect a little bit more about the role forgiveness might play in the ways we deal with the burdens as you described them, particularly in contexts where heavily weaponized or heavily militarized interventions to urban violence have led to irreparable harm or death.
Sure. Okay, this is something I haven't thought about. But it certainly is something that comes up all the time in relation to, in the South African context around the burden of the colonial past. And how do we move beyond the hurts of the past to be able to deal with the burdens of the future? And in that lies some degree of forgiveness, you know. And I think that a lot of the emerging new democratic South Africa was about forgiveness. It was about that, but it's proven very, very difficult to achieve. And in my understanding, part of the reason that forgiveness is so difficult is because the future looks so bleak, you know. And so if there was a possibility of a glimmer of a hope in the future, it may be more sensible to feel that forgiveness as having real consequences. And at the moment, that really isn't the case at all. But I do think that it is something that needs to be spoken about a lot more without the religious connotations that often are associated with the notion of forgiveness. So I think it's something useful. I haven't thought adequately about that, but I do know from my experience and from talking in forums around, you know, can we reach this goal of the post-colonial? Is it possible to reach the post-colonial goal? People are very resistant to that because of the fact that they just don't see a way out of the colonial past into the post-colonial future. And so forgiveness then becomes incredibly difficult to achieve. I think it's not easy to achieve forgiveness when there doesn't seem to be any fundamental change or different way of thinking going forward from both sides, actually, not just from one side. And it's a conversation that I think needs to continue. You know, I mean, will Syrians ever forgive the Americans, for example? Well, there's a lot that depends on. You know, is there going to be anything constructive about what comes out of that intervention? And let me not say what I think, but I mean that's really the answer.
Yeah. I might ask a question myself, if that's all right. Quickly, so I wonder actually if so much of the walling also has a post-colonial legacy in terms of relationship between kind of understandings of property and propriety, and whether that has shades of kind of a certain post-colonial legacy, first of all. And second question, just very practically, in terms of implementing both kind of drug decriminalization and kind of de-walling, I imagine there's a kind of short-term, long-term tension. So, you know, where you might have kind of a spike in abusive drug use or in crime, as soon as you remove a wall, in the long term it might plateau and level out and actually become much better than it really was. So I'm wondering, if that's the case, like it is for many other kind of drastic changes, how you convince people to focus on the long term over the short term. And maybe, well, I understand your skepticism of technology, whether technology affords perhaps a way to visualize long-term benefits over short-term costs.
Look, I'm certainly not anti-technology. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that the technological fix is not going to fix all conditions of human existence and human suffering. But I think certainly technological innovations and current mechanisms can go a long way to developing scenarios that would help us to vision far more forward than the immediate future. And I think that that's useful. But I sometimes think that, you know, that we can only see further into the future when we look beyond the today to the tomorrow and the next week, and then see what happens from there, and then try to imagine what could happen at a longer term basis. But we really don't know with absoluteness what that's going to look like, right? So you could have a period where breaking down the walls does lead to a less criminogenic existence for a period, and then maybe things turn around again when there's, say, for example, high levels of conflict between different groupings that are internal to a particular space, and then that may create new forms of insecurity, and you may find that there are other ways of having to deal with that, and it may mean refortressing at some point, and that may happen even in working class spaces. So, you know, these are all possibilities that are, you know, they are the unintended consequences that we always speak about, and we can't account for all of them. But what we do know is that our current solutions are not being effective, and so there has to be some way of at least saying what is an alternative, and not to say that the alternative is an absolute. And that's why the question about privacy is an important one, because there are competing interests all the time around this. In relation to the harm reduction thing and drug use, I think that that's a fairly long-term solution, because I think we've had 150 years of criminalization and penalization, which has not proven to have any positive results at all. And I'm sure 150 years ago they thought in the long-term future that would work, and it hasn't. So let's give it a try, you know, at least, and see. You know, there are no guarantees, because human interactions are so unpredictable. And then we may need to experiment again.
We are just on time, and it was fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for having interacted with yesterday's panel as well. So let's thank Monique for this amazing presentation.
So we'll break into two panels now. One panel will be in here, which is the panel on the shelter and ownership is going to be in here, and the other is in the
There is an InvestCore building, which is just behind this big concrete one. It looks like a big metal beast. It's Zaha Hadid building. Can't miss it. So that will be on health and safety, I believe.
If we get going in about 5 minutes, we've probably lost a bit of time. We'll catch up during the day.
Right, all this. panels in the law, isn't it?
That's right. So what we have
So interesting. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone, welcome to our first roundtable on shelter and ownership. I'm Nick, I'm a postdoc here at Urban Transformations. So we've got a wide range of panelists today for you. And we're going to try to look at very specific examples, people who do more kind of normative global work, trying to see what lessons can be learned across the context. So there's several kind of key questions that will come up, I think, not least of which is the fact that currently 85% of housing worldwide is built illegally. For example, more square miles are built by the so-called informal sector globally than architects and governments build combined. At the same time, in the so-called North, Europe and the US, we have questions over what are the limits of the welfare state and its ability to provide housing within traditional, so-called traditional models of the last century, last half century, and what are kind of alternatives, future ways of thinking about property rights, perhaps, or housing in general, but we'll get there in the conversation. So right now, today, we have Christophe Lalande, who's the housing unit leader at UN Habitat in Nairobi. We have Cecilia Wong in spatial planning in Manchester. Maria Christina Georgiadou in architecture at Westminster, and Kenneth Gibb in housing economics at Glasgow. So without further ado, because we're already running late, I'll start with Christophe.
So good morning everyone, I'm Christophe Lalande. I work in Nairobi at the global headquarters of UN Habitat, so I'm actually leading the housing unit, so the work of UN Habitat and the United Nations in terms of housing policy development. So I'm very grateful for the invitation. I mean, I'm very happy to be invited and to be here with you today, because this is also part of a longer term partnership we have with your research center. So I'm very glad that we can share a few thoughts on the housing sector globally. I had a bit of an issue with the title of the session. This is something I share with Nick because it's about shelter and ownership. And I think that we're, from our point of view, not really talking about shelter, but more about housing. And also, the work that we're promoting at the global level is really to provide housing for everyone, especially for the most poor. And ownership is not usually the main model that we're promoting at country level. So, but I'm going to present you the main issues that we are seeing in the different countries where we are working, different countries that we are supporting to develop their national housing policy frameworks. I've divided the presentation in 4 parts. The main one, the first one would be really about presenting the main key challenges of the global housing sector. Secondly, I will make reference to the global agenda in terms of housing. I will also present the work that we are doing at the global level to promote the right to adequate housing for all. And finally, I will focus on the work that we are doing to promote affordable housing and to address the challenge of housing affordability at the global level. So trying to understand the global housing challenges, I think that most of you are quite aware with these issues, but here are some data that we're working with, and that are really the facts and figures that are really supporting and also pushing our work, motivating our work. At global level, we have more than 1 billion people living in slums, but beyond that, we have 2.4 billion people living without access to improved sanitation. You have also issues of affordability. We counted that there is almost 500 million people, 500 million affordable houses that are needed by 2025. So it's a major issue. We talked about the global affordability challenge some years ago with the McKinsey Research Institute. In our work, we also tackled the issues of housing in the context of post-disaster, post-crisis. We are looking into the issues of risk exposure. We are looking into the issues of green buildings, looking at unsustainable designs, or we can improve access to affordable housing through sustainable designs. And finally, we are also looking at the issues of unlawful forced evictions, and this is a major component of our work, and I think that is also in the DNA of the work of a UN agency, to promote the right to adequate housing as part of human rights. This is maybe the main key message that I would like to share, that when we work on housing and when we want to work with governments and for them to understand something, that housing is not about a sectoral approach, it's not a silo approach. And when we build houses, beyond that, we are building homes, but even beyond that, I think that we are building cities. And I think that this is something very important to have in mind. The way that we are going to design housing, the way that we are going to propose housing to people and to include people in the city is very determinant for the future of the city and maybe reaching the good city. This is also the way that we are looking at housing. Some years ago, preparing for Habitat 3, we developed a new conceptual approach that we call the housing at the center approach. This was really with this idea to promote housing beyond the housing sector, to connect housing with the urban development overall. And by that we mean also a universal approach, universal understanding of housing. So, for example, we saw in many countries that the investment in the housing sector was having a positive impact on the health component of the national development. This was, for example, data that we got from the Canadian government, and it was very interesting to see that $1 invested in the housing sector was allowing the government to save more money in the health policy. But also we believe that by providing housing to the most poor, better housing conditions, we can really provide better access to education and improve security and safety in cities, and also improve access to other type of opportunities and participation at city level. Talking about housing at the global level is also really promoting the right to adequate housing. So this is the different 7 components that are constituting the right to adequate housing. I think that everyone is very familiar with that. This is really like the basis of our work, and based on these different components, we have been like structuring the way that we approach the different challenges of our housing. So there is the issues of legal security of tenure, of habitability, availability of services, accessibility, location, cultural adequacy, very important component, but also maybe the most important in the new urban agenda, the affordability of the housing stock. So since a couple of years, in particular since Quito and the adoption of the Quito Declaration, we have a new framework that we call the New Urban Agenda. But in addition, we have an overall development framework that is promoted by the UN and supported by all our member states. It's like the Sustainable Development Goals. For us, it's a very powerful and impactful framework, and to be able to deliver the activities we are doing at country level. I'm very proud to say that actually the target on providing adequate affordable housing for countries was one of the first that was approved and that we started monitoring at country levels in all the world regions. So it's a very actually important instrument, because we saw that in the past decades our main challenge was actually like the data collection to be able to measure progress in countries. And where we're talking about comparison between countries, this is like very important to have this type of framework. But we also have the New Urban Agenda, and which is like putting a very strong emphasis on the right to adequate housing, on the idea of leaving no one behind, to provide adequate and affordable housing for all in cities. So this is like a sort of very synthesized scheme that is like presenting the work we are doing at the global level. It varies from countries to countries, and it's very interesting that we can go through that together, because I think we will really understand how we can like adjust our approach from countries from the south. I also don't like to mention this to qualify countries from the south, but it's also very difficult to talk about developing countries and developed countries, because more and more we see that it's actually very different and very, very challenging to be able to have like specific public policies for developing countries, or countries from the south, or countries for the north. I will talk a little bit more about that, but these are like 5 main components that are really instrumental to be able to provide affordable housing for all. So I mentioned this concept of housing at the center. This was a conceptual approach. It's really illustrating the evolution of the work of the United Nations to promote the right to adequate housing for all, globally, but also at country level. We really moved from the Habitat Agenda approach of the enabling approach in '96 towards something much more integrated, looking at different areas of urban development. So as I mentioned, we really look at like the interconnection between urban planning, city design, and the provision of housing, with a very strong emphasis on human rights and inclusiveness. This was very instrumental in Quito to really like a very strong buy-in from member states. Our first area of work is really like the development of national housing policy development. Over the past year, we've been like supporting I think 32 national governments to develop or to redevelop the national housing policy frameworks. So it's actually like the main part of our work is to provide direct support to ministers of housing at country level. In the work of Habitat, I will be very quick then. We had like the history to work much more with developing countries or least developed countries. Over the past year, we had a very interesting evolution where actually we have been requested to provide more specific support to like countries from the north. So I was like 2 weeks ago in Lesotho, where we closed a project we started a couple of years ago. We usually start with an assessment phase of the national housing sector, to like the formulation of the national housing policy and the formulation of the strategy of implementation, with very specific programs of intervention for the government to be able to implement the right to adequate housing at local level. So this was a very interesting and important success for UN Habitat, with a very strong buy-in from the countries. But what it shows is really like also like the divide in between our work in developing countries and more developed countries. And if I could highlight maybe the main difference is that usually when we work in developing countries, we're really working on the development of the regulatory framework, the policy framework that does not exist or is not effective. When we work in developed countries, countries from the north, next week, for example, we'll be in Ukraine, in Kiev. The week after, we go to Bulgaria. The idea is really to have like more targeted interventions on very specific social issues or environmental regulations. So we also have a very important work to promote the right to adequate housing. I will go very quickly through these different thematics because I don't have enough time, but this is like really the DNA of our work, the main areas of intervention at country level. We work very closely with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to promote the right to adequate housing for all. And we see that now the provision of affordable housing, housing affordability, may be the main instrument to reach the realization of these rights in developing countries. We also work on the issues of culture and diversity, which is like a very important thematic, and also we believe that this is really crucial in the design and implementation of national housing policies. For too long, we know national government had a very static views of the housing sector. And what we want to see is that we need to consider the diversity of people and the diversity of needs to have like national housing policies that are actually reflecting the needs of people and to be able like to develop tailor-made housing policies and programs. So we work, for example, on the issues of urban migration, access to housing for migrants, persons with disabilities, elderly persons, youth, and access to housing, gender issues. We also work on the issues of green buildings, not only from the perspective of climate change and environmental sustainability, but more importantly from the perspective of economic development. So when we are promoting in developing countries tools to promote green buildings, is really in view of actually like building some sort of local economic development cycle and to provide adequate housing and affordable housing for all. We have a very strong component of work on housing finance, and again, it varies greatly between like countries that are really like in crisis situation. I have a recent example of a rental housing scheme we have been developing for IDPs in Somalia. Very innovative housing tools that we are thinking now to export to another countries with a very different socio-economic context, which is Bahrain, which has a very interesting social housing programs with a very high value housing models. But we also work with like countries and regions to develop housing finance facility for countries, especially in developing countries, to be able to self-sustain social housing programs. So now we are in discussion with the African Union to have a global regional housing finance facility for Africa. I'm going to have like, these are like the final set of slides, but I wanted to meet a little bit the themes of the session to link all this work with the issues of the provision of affordable housing for all in countries. And Nick asked me to try to build a comparison between countries from the south and countries from the north. Again, it was very challenging because it's actually very difficult to compare the work we are doing in Bahrain or Brazil or Afghanistan and to really establish who is following which model. But what is very interesting is that to be able to address the global affordability gap, we need to work, on the diversity fronts. So when we work on the issues of the right to adequate housing, when we work on the issues of green building sustainabilities, on the issues of planning proper policies, we are really helping to address the issues of the cost of housing and to reduce the cost of housing, to make housing affordable for everyone. Which is very interesting is that we have like very different contexts of interventions, and if, for example, we work on the issues of human rights, we will have like an understanding in developing countries to really like prevent forced evictions, while we will work, in Europe or the EC region to promote inclusive regulation for older persons or youth and their access to housing. The same applies for our intervention of housing sustainability and green buildings. In developing countries, we will be like promoting local materials, while in like countries from the north, we will have a very strong focus on promoting energy efficiencies. finally, in terms of planning, very interesting entry point for us. Yeah, I'm sorry, is really like looking into supporting densification of housing, mixed use and inclusionary zoning in developing countries, while we see like increasing requests, especially from cities from the north. So I'm referring also like to the case of Barcelona that Mr. Parks referred to yesterday, and we see like an increasing issues, you know, with different type of use of housing and commodification of housing, especially through different type of like short-term lease for tourism housing with the model of Airbnb. So these are like models that we are aware of and that we are trying to address to continue like be able to provide affordable housing for all in the different regions. So thank you very much. But as a sort of conclusion, I also would like to see, and taking the opportunity to be representing the United Nations here, to see what I can also benefit from this conference. And I will be very happy to have your view of how we can better integrate our work, because I see that you are doing a lot of research that will be very interesting for us to be able to have more tailor-made approach for countries. We actually started to develop housing studios within Habitat. For, if I take the case of Lesotho or Bahrain, we will be very interested, based on the policy framework that we agreed that we set up with the national government or cities, to be able to have like action-oriented activities with groups of students or university to be able to deliver the products that the country is asking for. Thank you.
Good morning. So I'll follow up. So I'll talk about China, because it's our project is working on eco-urbanization in China. So my topic is, say, progressive transformation or reconstituted urbanism, because we always like to use the word progressive, transformative. So what does that mean? We're very progressive in the Victorian era. In the 1870s, we actually built the first council estate in London, in the Old Nickel neighborhood. We actually cleared the slum at that time, and we tried to get the star architect, tried to build the wonderful environment to see how we can housing the poor. But the latest archive now in the planner, in the recent issue, Sarah Wise actually say that only 11 out of 5,700 original residents that evicted from the slum area moved back to the council estate. And when Charles Wolfe went to do the survey in his team, and actually the local medical officer said, no attempt made to rehouse the people displaced. Not 5% are original residents. Those who largely occupied the spot were costermongers, little cabinet makers, and those who require stabling and workshops. But instead of trying to provide for them, the council has built extravagant blocks, quite unsuited to them and beyond their means. So even though some of these original vendors, they tried to go back to ask for premises in the council estate to do their business, they were not given permission. So that is actually quite shocking. So actually Sarah Wise called her is a star architect, because the architect basically admitted later on, you know, they really do the building for the middle class, or they see that as an invasion succession. If we actually get it for the middle class, then the poor people can go to the nicer environment. So, of course, nowadays, if you look at the color picture, not only we gentrify for the lower middle class or key worker, we gentrify for multi-millionaires that you can afford an apartment there, with designer boutique, coffee shop, and so on and so forth. So now, switch 100 years later to China, to Beijing. A fire happening in Daixing suburb on the 18th November 2017, while during Donald Trump's visit in one of the urban village, the informal settlement. So the government was quite angry, so swiftly they cracked down across the city of informal development, informal structures, and evicted the so-called low-end population. And that is actually to enforce, that's already an action plan in Beijing called dispersing, regulating, and upgrading. So as you can see, according to one of the newspaper, one of the old ladies said the feeling of the demolition was like the Japanese invade China at the time, going into the village. Because it's very brutal, 3 days. 3 days you have to be evicted. They stick the notice on your business. You can't run business. And there are certain people that just have baby and feel ill, they have to leave. So why we have this informal settlement in China? I think a lot of us have heard about urban village. So just keep the cartoon simple. So you have the beautiful city here, and it's expanding. And then here you have the rural folks in the village. They're waiting for the city to come and encroach them. Now in China, because you have the land right, so urban land is owned by the state, and they can auction the land use right to build things in the master plan. In the rural area, it is collective land ownership with the villagers collectively owned. So they can't develop in the rural area until they expropriate the land into construction land use quota. Then they can put in the master plan. So what happened? You can have this bizarre situation that with all the high-rise building, but with some really odd. So actually, they're not village look that what we imagine, but when they're so low-rise, you can tell something happened. So what happened is when the city expands, they need to fuel the growth machine of the manufacturing industry of cheap labor, low-value product that we get in the Christmas cracker. So what they do is, these people are rather entrepreneurial. They wait the city come from to them, but they also discover they can actually make illegal extension, informal building. They can have an informal housing market, very, very buoyant, to support the lower end of the poorer people or the migrant factory worker for other provinces, go to work in Beijing, Shanghai, or Guangzhou. So why these things exist? Because actually they tolerate it. In order to fuel the growth machine, they need the cheap labor. So the government, in a way, sort of close half the eye because it's quite useful for these people. They somehow